The Granblue Fantasy franchise began its life a decade ago in Japan. Whilst its plethora of characters and MMO-style gameplay has been a hit overseas, it feels like the series is finally turning heads in the West with Granblue Fantasy Relink, a new title in the series and Cygames' first foray into the home console market. With addictive gameplay loops, vibrant characters and art direction from Hideo Miniba, who previously worked on titles such as Final Fantasy V, 6, 9 and Lost Odyssey, Relink's strengths all come together into a cohesive package that ultimately puts gameplay at the forefront. The game certainly has its fair share of JRPG tropes, and toppling the ultimate darkness and saving the skies from complete destruction, kawaii but annoying support characters, a damsel in distress plotline and massive swords. However, Granblue Fantasy Relink shares little with the traditional JRPG. Opting to follow a mission structure in the same manner as Armored Core or Monster Hunter, where the player accepts various assignments from a quest counter that also reveals the rewards and enemies you will face. The game doesn't offer a sprawling world to traverse, although there are glimpses of this in the game's second chapter, where you are presented with wide open terrain and can tackle 3 objectives in whichever order you wish. But this tease of a semi-open world during the opening of the game feels like an empty promise, and perhaps a shift in design following Platinum Games' departure from the project in 2019. This level of exploration isn't true to the core of the game, however, and instead the player is presented with a staggering amount of quests to overcome. Whether it be waves of enemy hordes or the more popular boss battles, the player is rewarded with loot to upgrade weapons, craft new sigils, or unlock a new tier of quest difficulty. We got this. Whilst all these quests can be done offline with a party of CPUs, you are expected to maintain 4 characters who are leveled up and appropriately geared in order to combat some of the more challenging boss battles. This is a tall order as money, or rupees, can become scarce, and grinding MSP, the game's version of ability points, can be time consuming early on. Alternatively, players can tackle these quests cooperatively online with a party of 4, which gives you time to concentrate on what character you want to master. Relink's combat is simple enough to grasp early on, yet adds a satisfying level of depth as you progress, such as learning advanced combos, attack cancelling, and optimization of your current gear. It's a compelling gameplay loop that is always teasing you with the allure of raising your damage cap, weapon cap, or upgrading your abilities after each quest is complete. In order to max out your damage cap or fully upgrade your weapon, you are required to grind relentlessly for materials dropped from bosses and quests. But with a game so entrenched in this inevitability to grind, this raises the question, is it gratifying? It would be remiss of me not to mention the game's story. Although Granblue Fantasy Relink does offer a story mode, one that is necessary to complete in order to unlock the tumultuous endgame grind, it feels slightly tacked on to what makes the game really shine. The premise follows the standard JRPG plot device, and utilises the power of friendship to save the world from obliteration. The story mode certainly has some impressive set pieces and boss battles, but poor pacing is unavoidable considering the stop and start structure that the developers have opted for. Completing this story mode clocked in at just 15 hours or so, and I can't help but feel like we are being presented with a small snippet of Granblue's wider narrative, rather than witnessing a gripping tale with good story beats and character arcs that the genre is known for. This fleeting story may satisfy die-hard fans of the franchise, but for newcomers, we're left wondering what we're missing from Granblue's wider media. There's no shortage of Granblue content to explore, as the series has spawned an animation, a manga, and most recently a fighting game. Cygames assume you're at least somewhat familiar with the franchise going into Relink, and I feel like the developers have missed an opportunity to demonstrate what makes these characters so special. Each character's backstory and personality are told through various walls of text, demonstrating how they react to people and situations in the world. This is poor character building and feels incredibly rushed and uninspired. These sections had me skipping through the text as fast as possible just to get to the useful attribute points that these sections reward. While these sections are not essential, locking attributes behind them feels like the developers are forcing the player to experience them, in order to justify the absence of good storytelling. With 20 characters to handle, this is a tall mountain to climb, but it's not impossible. Compare Relink to a game like Suikoden or Chrono Cross that are known for having incredibly large party sizes, but also known for treating each character's personality and backstory with care. Both Relink and Chrono Cross opt for an anime aesthetic for their character designs, the latter having Nobuteru Yuki take the helm, who previously worked on the anime Escaflowne. It's certainly a charming art style that benefits both games' fulfillment of its characters' identities. Andrew Vestrel of GameSpot said of Chrono Cross's cast that, surprisingly, the title's seemingly endless supply of characters works to its benefit, not its detriment. Every last one of the 40-plus members is a unique, story-driven, and valuable contributor. Unlike many cast of thousands RPG epics, each character in Chrono Cross is an interesting and worthy addition to your team. Relink's characters offer very little in varied personalities, as they are not given appropriate time to breathe. Chrono Cross is set in the same world as its predecessor, but offered fans a fresh take on the Chrono formula. Relink could have benefited from a similar approach, creating characters who are separate to what came before, akin to Dragon Quest's anime counterpart in the early 1990s. Released internationally as Dragon Warrior, the anime offered new characters and stories that became such a hit in Japan that it even spawned a video game tie-in nearly 30 years later. Instead, Cygames have opted to rely heavily on its other forms of media to fill in the blanks. As a newcomer to the series, asking the player to watch the anime or sink some more time into the mobile gacha game, and spend more money, feels like the end goal here, but it leaves a bad taste in my mouth, and it feels like I've been cheated out of the true console action RPG that was promised. The story mode results in a too concise plotline that had me beelining for the endgame. It's disheartening to recommend a game based off the premise of the game really opens up after 20 hours once you beat the story, but well, it just kind of does. This is a perfectly fine thing to say about games as a service, or an MMO like Final Fantasy XIV for instance, although that game really opens up after 100 hours. But for a game that is attempting to brand itself as a standalone console action RPG, this feels somewhat like the game is trying to disguise itself. This is a spin-off story to a mobile gacha game after all, and I can't help but feel like this DNA has seeped into Relink, minus the monetization, as the game truly becomes loot boxes galore. However, the presentation and vibrancy of these characters is extremely polished. Leaning heavily into its anime aesthetic, this results in a beautiful culmination of the series' cross-media adaptations. Each character's personality is realised through great voice acting and visual flair. Grinding through Granblue Fantasy Relink's endgame is undeniably where the quest structure of the game shines, and is where I personally started experimenting with different characters' movesets. Opting for a crewmate who specialised more in support and ranged abilities immediately clicked with me. It gave me space against tough bosses who were in their overdrive state, a relentless onslaught where the boss enters its true attack phase. In order to break this phase, all players must whittle down the enemy's overdrive gauge and are forced to fight offensively during the most dangerous section of the battle. Oh. Jesus. It's an exciting challenge and one that contributes greatly to the ebb and flow of combat. And these brief moments of dishing out insane amounts of damage are usually followed by sections of well-timed dodging or blocking or avoiding AoE markers flooding the battle arena. As the quest difficulty ramps up, these AoEs spawn faster, hit harder, and become overwhelming. One aspect of the increased difficulty tiers that is disappointing, however, is the reuse of the same handful of bosses time and time again. The game offers little variety in enemy design and forces players to combat rehashed battles, only with harder hitting attacks and faster response times. There is a hollow sense of progression that comes with noticing that your damage output is a slightly bigger number than it was the last time you faced off against a boss who has now had a simple reskin. Going back to the original question of this review, is it all gratifying? The answer is yes and no. One of the most attractive aspects of having that capped weapon or high damage output in a traditional MMO is for prestige. Rocking up to the city square with that new shiny relic weapon is an unmatched feeling, and I found myself yearning for a similar thrill in Relink. Sharing this world with players within a physical space, rather than confining us into short 5-10 minute battle arenas, could have created a better sense of community. There is a hub world where you can interact with your party, but this is limited to only your party. Recruiting other players with a similar power level is locked behind a matchmaking menu, and this in turn constricts the satisfaction of the grind, and compelled me to seek out a sense of community on Discord rather than communicating with players in-game. Taking on some of the game's harder quests through random matchmaking is a complete gamble. Sometimes your party will be completely OP and never get hit once, and other times you'll be running around the arena, healing, reviving, and trying not to die rather than pummeling the boss itself. With a game that relies so heavily on cooperative play, it would have done well in offering a hub to meet players and talk strats and find a party that suits well with your gameplay style and level. Perhaps not going as far as a full-fledged MMO, but limiting the sense of community to third-party software like Discord feels like the more gratifying aspects of a game like this are locked behind a door that most players won't bother to seek out. In summary, Granblue Fantasy Relink can be more than the sum of its parts. Whilst its story feels vapid in places and the overbearing reliance on grinding may alienate some players from reaching the most gripping aspects of its rich combat system, it's hard not to appreciate Relink's innovation. Cygames have taken a gamble and an untraditional mission structure in the guise of a JRPG, suggesting that the genre is evolving into something that makes sense in the modern gaming era. To quote a guide to Japanese role-playing games published by Bitmap Books, the genre isn't quite as prolific as it was back in the 80s and 90s. Japanese RPGs are still an essential part of the vibrant video game landscape. They still provide unique mechanics, distinct visual styles, brilliant soundtracks, innovative stories, and other aspects that make them stand apart from their Western-developed counterparts. It's a sentiment that still holds up to Granblue Fantasy Relink. Whilst the innovative story aspect may be absent, the game still offers unique battle mechanics and a quest format that certainly sets itself apart from other games in the genre, and offers something fresh and unique to the JRPG space that should be commended. But when the game itself is relying so heavily on its prior world building, everything can still fall flat. Given the game's impressive sales, this isn't the last we'll see of Relink. Whether this results in hefty DLC to vary the stagnating repetition of boss battles, or a new game entirely, it's an exciting future for the world of Granblue Fantasy, and one I will certainly be watching with interest.